this is part 2 of figuring out why this LLY won't start. On part 1, I pulled off that valve cover to see if all the rockers were moving to identify a broken camshaft. All of them are in fact moving. So in this part, I'm going to remove the timing cover to see if the cam gear is sheared off of the camshaft. So first thing I gotta do is take that belt off. Tensioner is easy to access, unlike Ford's. Then I'm going to pull the compressor. I should be able to leave the lines hooked up and just swing it out of the way. Then unbolt the power steering pump so it moves out of the way. Undo the whole bracket with the alternator attached. Leave the alternator attached and just move the bracket out of the way. Drain the coolant. Remove the water pump. Remove the harmonic balancer. And then should be able to remove the timing cover, I believe. Alright, got the AC compressor out of the way. It'll sit out of the way with all the lines connected still. It's real simple, just 4 bolts on it. I removed this upper fan shroud so I could get easier access to the rest of the bolts that I need to take off. I'm not sure if I'm going to take the fan off the water pump yet or not, because the water pump has to come off, but I got room for everything else, so I might just leave it on there right now. But we'll see. Well, I was wrong about the fan not having to come off. I got the alternator bracket unbolted, and it won't come all the way off because the fan's in the way. But it's still pretty simple to do. Alternator bracket just had 2 nuts, then a bolt behind the tensioner, couple bolts for this line, and obviously the connector and the charging cable on the back of the alternator. Once I get the fan out of the way, I'll just pull the whole thing out of the way instead of swinging it to the side like I planned. Got the power steering pump bracket unbolted now. There's just 1 bolt here, 2 bolts right here, and then 1 hidden all the way down here. But once those are off, it'll swing out of the way enough to make it where you can get the water pump off. First I gotta take this whole assembly off, then I could get the water pump off from the looks of it. Alright, I finally got that coolant crossover pipe off, or whatever you want to call it. It was a little more of a pain than I was expecting, but it's off nonetheless. There's 2 nuts on each side and 2 bolts on each side. Then I had to take the thermostat housing off the top of it, which has 4 bolts. Well, plus the bolt from the upper radiator hose going into it. I had to take that off in order to get it out of here. Oil fill tube had to come off. I had to unbolt this. I'm just going to try to leave that hanging because I don't feel like taking this line off because it runs all the way under there and I don't want to create a leak right there. So water pump's next. Next thing I had to do was take this big idler pulley off, or whatever you want to call it. It had 3 bolts and 2 nuts on it. It was bolted right here above the crank pulley. Then I had a hell of a time getting this crank pulley off because the bolt right here, which is a 36mm 12 point, that bolt was on there tight enough to break 3 breaker bars. 1 of them snap-on, the other 2 cobalt, and that was with the starter, and still didn't break the bolt loose. So I had to buy the special tool that you put into the flywheel to keep the motor from rotating. Then this other snap-on breaker bar with that 5 foot or so pipe on it finally broke the bolt loose. I got it out, got the pulley off. The pulley hides the last nut for the water pump right here. Gonna pull the water pump off, then pull the rest of the bolts out of the front cover, and it should slide off. Got the timing cover off. Bolts should be pretty obvious on it, what to take off. The big 19 that's right here, you do not have to take off. On the bottom, there's a few Allen heads. Once you have all that stuff off, it'll pull right off. I set the timing up. And surprisingly, it is in time. Not sure if you can see those dots. There's one dot on the crankshaft and 2 dots on the cam. It is in time, so on to the next step.